Well, hi, John Miller here on the Friday Devotional, and we are dealing with a part two of In Search of the Biblical Church. And so, what the church often is, opposed to what the church ought to be. And as we said last time, the church that often is, the worship service is a show that we come to watch. Just like because we're an entertainment society, we tend to look at church when we come to church to think, well, hey, what's going to be up on the platform? How are the performers going to perform? And it's just the opposite. The church that ought to be is the church that recognizes that God is the audience and we are the participants that come to offer as a fragrant aroma up to God our hearts to Him in the midst of worship and prayer and confession. And so He's watching us and He's saying, all right, I'm excited to hear your heart. And if you look at it that way next Sunday, you will come into that sanctuary and into worship with a whole different mindset. And then we learned last time that the church often is just a building. The church that ought to be is church. The word ecclesia is a gathering of the saints, the community of believers. And so that is the church that ought to be. We ought to see it that way, not just a church structure, physical structure on a corner. We ought to see that the church is actually when we all come together, there the Spirit of the Lord is, and the church is gathered, and it's a beautiful thing. Number three, the church that often is a come-oriented structure. In other words, you come to us to find Jesus. We expect people to come into our community and then get to know Jesus, where the church that ought to be is more go-oriented structures, where we represent Jesus to a watching world, that we're the salt and the light that penetrates society by being involved in the community, in our neighborhoods, reaching out to our sphere of influence. And that's the kind of church that ought to be, where we are reaching the world for Jesus rather than hunkering down and saying, us four no more, shut the door, kind of thing. But there are churches like that. Number four, this time, is the church is static. The church that often is a static church. In other words, they don't change. There's a status quo. They have trouble adjusting to the social changes in our culture. The church that ought to be is a dynamic church in that the message never changes, but the methods do change, and it's okay that they change to speak to the culture around us. And so, in other words, the music may change, the vocabulary that we use may change, but the message of the gospel never changes. So there you go. There are some of the aspects of the church that often is, as opposed to the church that ought to be. And I hope this is helpful in this short video today, and that you have a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.